All right, guys. So today we are going to start talking about how we actually gather samples. So the last 3 chapters have sort of been about, okay, if we have data, what do we do with it? We're going to kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, where did this data come from? How did we actually get these samples in the first place? So to begin, we are going to look at actually bad samples, and then we'll kind of go back and talk about some good ones. So a couple of things to define. First of all, we know a population is a whole group of anything, actually, in statistics. So it's not necessarily people. But let's talk some practicality for a second. So it says a population is, and you're supposed to put an entire group of individuals and again, those individuals don't necessarily have to be people. And if I want to know a piece of information about a population, very rarely am I actually going to go take that information from an entire population. So here's what I mean. If I want to know the average income of every adult American, I really don't see an easy way of gathering that data from all adult Americans. Like, that's crazy. That's probably not going to happen. First of all, how do I track down everybody? Do I do it with their address? Well, what about people who move a lot? Or what about people who don't have registered addresses? What about homelessness? So when we gather information from a population, that's really, really hard to do. But we actually do try it once every 10 years or so. And that is called actually a census. So a census is data collected from the entire population. So, and a census is data collected from all these individuals. So if I did happen to find every single person in America's income, that would be a census because it's data from a whole population. But very rarely is that a practical thing to do unless you have a small population. So, all right, well, what about when your population is large? How do you get that information without actually trying to track down everybody? Well, you're going to take a sample. You're going to hopefully take a sample that's representative of the whole population, and then you would actually get a piece of data, and that data should pretty much be close to the real data for the entire population as long as you took a good representative sample of the whole population. So we know a sample is a smaller selection of the population. From which we actually gather data. So most data that you see, most data that you get about really pretty much anything usually comes from a sample, just because it's impossible usually to track down an entire population. And as long as the sample is representative, so a representative sample, then you have a pretty good shot of having a pretty close estimation to the real population value. So a representative sample is one that accurately, as the name implies, reflects the population. So maybe if I was trying to find the average income of every adult American, maybe I would take a sample of adult Americans, and as long as that sample represents pretty much every group you would get in the proportions that they are in, meaning you don't have too many rich people, too many middle class, whatever. As long as the sample is representative, then the average income number that I get should be pretty close to the real average income of the entire population. But before we get to that, we're going to talk quickly about an example. So one of the things you're going to be asked to do on the AP test actually is to identify a population in a sample. And this is actually a really common question. Oftentimes it comes up as a multiple choice. So here's sort of an example of what that would look like, and feel free to pause this, do the example, and then check your answer in a little bit. But it says, Brissette is interested to find the proportion of her students who have visited Yosemite National Park. Out of her 5 classes, she chooses one of her classes at random, which happens to be AP Stats. She surveys the class and finds that 43% of the class have visited Yosemite. Identify the population in the sample. So when you're asked to identify a population in a sample, they're usually not asking you for a number. They're asking you for who or what is the population. Who or what was the sample. Sometimes they will give you a number, sometimes they will not. So in this case, who is my population of interest? Well, it's not the proportion of all Edison students, it's just my students. It's just Brissette students. So in this case, the population is just all students in Brissette's 5 classes. Okay. So then in this case, well, who's the sample? Well, from this explanation, it sounds like she randomly selected one class, which happened to be AP Stats. Makes sense. 4 of my classes are AP Stats. 1 is Algebra 2. So my sample would be the students from that chosen AP Stats class. Okay, so as mentioned previously, we are going to actually today mainly park it and look at bad samples. So basically, the whole goal is my sample needs to be representative, and there are a bunch of different ways we can do that, depending on the situation. But the danger is if my sample is not representative, then my result might not be accurate. So for example, if I'm trying to estimate the income of every American, and I mainly just select people from cities that are known to be wealthy, like let's say most of my sample is from places like Malibu or Marin County in the Bay Area, then I'm going to get a really, really high average income. In fact, that average income isn't going to be what the real average income of Americans is. It's going to be way higher because I'm sampling badly. I'm only looking at the wealthy areas. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. And that specific idea is called bias. And so bias is when we consistently over or underestimate a certain value that we're trying to figure out. Okay, so bias occurs when we consistently over or underestimate a value of interest for a population. Okay, So when you hear the term bias, you want to almost think of bias in terms of a number. I know like bias sort of tends to, for us, seem unfair, which it of course is. You're wrongly estimating a value, but it's not necessarily always like evil or malicious. Bias is simply a matter of, listen, if you took a bad sample, or if you did something with your study wrongly, you're going to get an inaccurate result. And so the inaccurate result, because of what you did, that's bias, essentially. So unfortunately, we got to talk about bias, and we have to talk about bad sampling methods because real adults gathering real data use these bad sampling methods all the time. And so let's kind of look at a couple pictures of some bad sampling methods that are used a ton. So let's say that I am interested in finding out the average GPA right now of every student at Edison. I'm not a counselor. I don't have access to all of your Atlas information right now. And I am way too lazy to go and like ask every kid what their GPA is. So instead, what I'm going to do is I am going to take a sample of my students. So I'm going to say, all right, I got 4 AP Stats classes. I got 1 Algebra 2. I'm going to go ahead and assume that these classes are representative of Edison High School, and I'm going to find the GPA of all of my own kids. And so let's say I do that. Let's say that I take the GPA of all of my classes, Stats and Algebra 2, and I take every kid's GPA and I find the average GPA. And let's say that the average I find is a 3.82. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, well, the average I found was a 3.82, so I'm guessing the true average GPA of every student at Edison is something around 3.82. So that's going to be what I assume. However, in real life, let's say, the average GPA of all students at Edison is actually probably more like a 3.1. So what the heck? Why is my estimate so far off, and it's considerably higher than the true average GPA of all of Edison? Well, let's look at my sample. I took 5 classes of my own classes, 4 of which are what kind of a class, people? It's AP class. So now I understand this isn't exactly like, I don't know, what's the fancy AP? Like AP Chem, is that fancy? I understand this isn't like a glamorous fancy AP Chem type of situation, but pretty much everybody in all of my classes are seniors, and any senior taking an AP class, this is probably not your first AP class. So my classes are mostly AP classes, and the type of kid who takes an AP class is most likely the type of kid who's good at school, who has a higher GPA, and who's interested in going to college. So perhaps that's why the average GPA for my classes was so far above what the true average GPA for all of Edison was, because I have mostly AP kids. Not only that, but my other class is Algebra 2. And so between Algebra 2 and AP Stats, I have almost all either juniors or seniors. And in case you didn't know this, the group with the lowest GPA actually are freshmen. And that's frankly, sadly, because nobody's dropped out yet. The people with really terribly low GPAs will eventually drop out. They might go to Cambridge and then come back, but they're gonna eventually drop out. So not only is my sample not representative because I have AP kids, it's also not representative because I have older kids who tend to have higher average GPAs. So all of this to say, the sample that I just took to try to represent Edison was a bad sample. And the sample I took has a name. Sorry, lots of talking. It's called a convenience sample, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a sample that is convenient to take. And so a convenience sample consists of choosing individuals that are easy to reach. And for me, I teach these 5 classes. These are the easiest people to get a hold of because they literally are in my classroom. So that's what I did. I went ahead and took a convenience sample. And of course, I'm going to end up with a bias. Actually. And the type of bias that has been created by taking a convenience sample is something called undercoverage. And undercoverage, again, sort of is what it sounds like. Undercoverage bias means that you are not covering every group that should be representative of the whole population. So in a convenience sample, some of the population that needs to be represented is left out. So convenience sample, I just find people or things that are easy to reach. I take my sample, I get a result, and that result will almost certainly be biased because it's not truly representative of the population that I'm trying to find information about. So that's kind of a lame sample. It's not super common in like the academic areas and in real studies, but it can happen. The one that is really common though is our next guy. Voluntary response sample. So let me paint a picture for you. You're in the drive-through line that's 17 cars long at Dutch Brothers. Yes, Brothers, you heard me. And you're going to order your giant monster-infused slushy drink that's a violet color and will probably result in Crohn's disease for you later on, but whatever. And you're in line for this drink. You finally get to the actual little window thing. You get your drink. And the person working there says, hey, at the bottom of your seat, there's a survey. Go ahead and fill in that survey and tell us if we did a good job. Okay, let's real talk for a second. We've all experienced this in some capacity. Most of the time it's like fast food, but go with me. They give you a survey at the bottom of your receipt. Your response is probably going to be my response, which is, okay, thanks. Take the receipt, shove in my purse, never think about it or look at it again. Okay? So let's talk about what just happened. They're trying to have you fill out a survey. They're putting it on the bottom of your receipt, but ultimately, who's responsible for this survey? You are. And we're all busy people. We have all got lots of stuff to do. Filling out a survey for you is probably not something I'm going to do, unless 2 scenarios. 1. Scenario number 1, you know that it's going to take about 20 minutes to go through the Dutch Bros line. You've banked on that. You know what drink you want. You order your drink. It does take 20 minutes. You get your drink. Everything is as expected. They give you the survey. You ignore the survey because you've got to get to school. You've got work to do. Scenario number 2. Every morning pretty much always takes 20 minutes. Always order the same drink, etc. This morning, for some reason, like everything is against you. You have a test first period. And you've banked on your 20 minutes, you've even given yourself some time to spare, but actually something weird happens and it takes 35 minutes to get through the line. Not only that, but they mess up your drink for the first time in forever. And you don't have time for them to fix it because you're already on your way to school because you're late because it took 35 minutes to get through the line. So in this case, oh, and by the way, the person who worked there was super rude to you. So in this case, they give you a survey at the bottom. What might you later do? You might actually fill that one out this time because you're pissed and you want to take it out on somebody. So here's the issue with voluntary surveys or voluntary response samples, like we're going to define in a second. You are way more likely to respond to the surveys if you feel strongly about the survey situation. So if you've done everything you're supposed to do as Dutch Bros, I'm probably not going to fill out your survey. Oh, but if you mess up my order on the wrong day at the wrong time, yeah, you're going to be hearing from me because you messed up my day, I will mess up your day. That's sort of how this goes. So voluntary response samples create bias because only those with strong opinions are going to respond, and most of those strong opinions, folks, are going to be negative. So let's talk. So voluntary response, oopsie, whoa. What happened? Coming back. So voluntary response samples go like this. People choose themselves to be part of a sample. Which sounds all good in theory, like, all right, well, I don't want to do this sample thing that you're talking about, so why not let somebody who actually cares? Well, because you're trying to represent a population. So think of it like this. Let's say Dutch Brothers in general, Dutch Bros, whatever, Dutch. In general, most people are perfectly satisfied with the way that Dutch Bros runs. And most of the time, most days, most people get exactly the drink they want and exactly the time that they're expecting. However, you have that one day when maybe they're short a barista or whatever, and it's just going way too slowly and everybody has a terrible experience. In that case, you're going to get a lot of negative reviews when in reality, most of the people, most of the time who go to Dutch Bros are perfectly satisfied. But if you look on Yelp, you might not get all 5 stars because of that one day. So if the idea is to have a representative sample of all customer experiences at Dutch Bros, a voluntary sample is a bad way to do that because you're mainly only going to hear negative. And you're going to mainly only hear negative for 2 reasons. So the type of bias created in this case, we have 2. We have response bias, which is when only those with strong opinions respond. And then you have non-response bias, which for a while sort of made me angry that these were 2 different things, but AP really feels like these are 2 different things. And non-response bias is basically what is true for the rest of the group, which is if you don't have a strong opinion, you're not going to choose to respond, and therefore you're not going to be represented. So those without strong opinions choose not to respond and are not represented. Oops. Respond. So the response bias, in this case, the Dutch Bros example, will basically mean that you're going to have more negative responses than you should have because only those with strong opinions are going to respond. And then the non-response bias means that you're going to have fewer positive responses than you should have because the people who are satisfied are probably just going to move on with their day and not really worry about giving you a good rating if you're Dutch Brothers. So voluntary response samples are bad because you have 2 types of biases created because people can choose to either not answer the survey or to answer the survey. The issue with voluntary response biases, though, is this, which is sometimes you can't force somebody to answer a survey. So the only way you're going to get any information of any kind is to make it voluntary. So you understand why people use voluntary surveys, mainly because there's not really any other options, but just beware. So when you hear of data that's been voluntarily collected, just know that it is very likely not going to be representative of the entire population as a whole. And then finally, we have wording of the question, and then we'll look at an example. So another type of bias that can happen is how you ask a survey question. And it could literally be how you ask the question. It can be your tone when you ask the question. It could even be the situation in which you ask a question. So, for example, if I wrote down on a survey, every year, trash kills cute little baby seagulls on the coast of, I don't know, Germany, whatever, I'm going with this. Do you think you should recycle? Okay, well, I'm giving you that little piece of tidbit information about cute baby seagulls that trash is murdering right now, and then asking you if you should recycle. Because I've worded the question that way, I'm really just asking you, hey, do you think you should murder cute baby seagulls? And most people are probably going to answer no, just because of how I've worded the question. So when they're asking a question, hey, do you think we should recycle? Most people are going to say, yeah, we should recycle because we shouldn't kill cute little baby seagulls. And it's all based on how I've worded that question. Another situation, how I'm wording the question or what I'm saying, was actually on the AP test last year, which was, they described a situation where an environmental science teacher wanted to know what proportion of her kids regularly recycled. And so to find out that information, she pulled each kid aside, like one at a time, and asked the kid just face to face, hey, do you recycle? Okay, well, if my environmental science teacher pulled me aside and like one-on-one, just me and this teacher, and asked me if I recycled, I'm going to say yes, even if I don't regularly recycle, because I don't want to disappoint this person. So even the manner in which she asked this question, pulling somebody aside to talk to them one-on-one instead of making it anonymous, for example, is going to skew the results of that question. And she might find that 87% of her kids recycle. And that's probably not true because many of them will have felt pressured to lie to her. So here's the moral of the story, people. The wording of a question, how a question is asked or worded, can absolutely sway answers and create biased results. So kind of keep that in mind. That's especially going to come to light when you guys do your projects at the end of the year. Because, I mean, I'm telling you right now, the kids last year would come to me and be like, I asked this question, but I'm pretty sure people lied to me just because they were embarrassed or whatever. And it's true. The way you ask a question can absolutely sway results. Finally, these three sort of types of bad sampling methods or biases created, these are not by any means the only way bias can be created. There are many bad ways to take a sample. So just keep in mind that these are only some ways bias can occur. So there are many different ways that bias can occur. Happened again, dang it. There are many different ways that bias can occur, and so a lot of what we're going to be looking at is going to require a lot of common sense from y'all. So let's look at a problem where you would have to actually kind of use a little common sense with this. You can also learn a little bit of, or use a little bit of what we just learned as well. So if you want to read this example to yourself, you can go ahead and pause this, try it, and then compare your answer with mine when you play it again. But here it goes. An advertisement for an upcoming TV show asked, should handgun control be tougher? So meaning, should we try to ban guns more actively, essentially? You call the shots in a special call-in poll tonight. If yes, call 1-900-720-6181. If no, call 1-900-720-6182. Charge is 50 cents for the first minute. Over 90% of the people who called said yes. Explain why this opinion poll is almost certainly biased. Okay. So again, if you want to pause and kind of discuss, there's a ton of things with the way that this sample is being taken that are going to get you biased results. But to begin, because there are a bunch of different things that are wrong with this sample, I'm going to just start by saying this opinion poll is probably biased for a few reasons. So one, talk to me about this poll. Who is going to be answering this poll? Well, it's a call-in poll that you have to actually pay for to answer. So this is a voluntary response sample. You are asking for volunteers to share their opinion. Not only that, but their opinion is going to cost some money as well, 50 cents for the first minute. So that being said, this is clearly a voluntary situation, so only those with strong opinions about gun control are going to be responding to this. So let's begin with first. The opinion poll is voluntary and costs money. So only those with very strong opinions about gun control. Dog, seriously. Will respond. I apologize. My dog and I are recording this lesson, and he really doesn't like anybody, evidently. Okay. So first of all, the opinion poll is voluntary, costs money, so only those with very strong opinions about gun control will respond. So that's clearly not going to represent everybody. It's only going to represent people with strong opinions. We got another issue as well, though. How would you know to actually call in and vote on this poll? Well, this was an advertisement for an upcoming TV show. So that, in a way, is sort of a convenience sample. If the TV station is interested in finding an opinion about this poll, the easiest way for them to do this is to actually advertise for this poll to be answered, which is what they did. So here's the deal. There is an advertisement for an upcoming TV show. So presumably the people watching TV are people who watch this particular TV show. Well, I don't know what this TV show is. It could be like a TV show about why guns are terrible. Well, okay, if that's what the TV show is, then of course the majority of people watching this TV show are going to say, yeah, we need more gun control. I just don't know. And so the second issue here is because this poll was advertised in conjunction with a TV show, we don't know if the viewers of this TV show are representative or not. In fact, we're going to go ahead and guess that they are not. So secondly, the poll was advertised with a TV show whose viewers may favor gun control more than the general population would. Therefore, the sample response of 90% saying yes might not be accurate. Okay. So this explanation is kind of a lot of things going on. Frankly, if you answered this and then now you're checking your answer, you don't really need all of this. You just need a couple of things. So if you just mentioned that the opinion poll was voluntary, and that only those with strong opinions would respond, that's good. That's fine. If you just said, hey, this was advertised with a TV show and didn't mention the voluntary nature of this, that's also fine. But what you need to make sure that you do is you need to make sure you connect why this would be biased back to the actual context of gun control. So specifically, in mine, I kind of mentioned a couple of things. So it's voluntary and costs money, so only those with very strong opinions about gun control will respond. I mentioned gun control explicitly. And not only that, but when I continue to explain, I gave an example of how this could be biased. So I'm saying it could be biased because people who watch the TV show might favor gun control more than the general population. Now, you could have said they might favor gun control less than the entire population. That's totally fine. But the deal is you have to connect how the sample is biased back to the way that they took the sample. So you can't just say it's biased because it's voluntary. Not good enough. We got to connect that back to context. You can't just say it's biased because it was advertised as a TV show. Not good enough. How is that biased? Why would that create a problem? It's biased because they charge money. Okay, that's great. How is that biased? You might even say people with guns probably tend to be poorer maybe than people without guns. And so since this costs money, the people who would actually pay money to respond to this probably are more wealthy, which means they're less likely to have guns. That's a beautiful explanation. I didn't write any of that, but that's beautiful. You could totally say that. Just make sure you A, use common sense, and B, make sure you back up how your sample would cause bias in this context. All right, y'all. So that is today's lesson, which is bad samples. The next few lessons, you're going to look at how we collect good samples, and why the samples are good, when you would use them. We specifically in AP Stats look at 3 different specific ways to collect samples, but there are, of course, a lot more. So hopefully you will enjoy that. Have a lovely day.